I'm going to show you how to make your own bias tape from fabric today. And we're going to start with a yard of fabric. You can really use any size of fabric. You can use a fat quarter for this or a half yard. It doesn't matter how much fabric you have. You can, you basically just want to start with a rectangle of fabric, but we're going to do a yard of fabric, which is going to give us about 24 yards of finished bias tape. First, we're going to cut the fabric at a diagonal, at a 45-degree diagonal, so that we can make a big chunk of bias fabric. And the way that you find that diagonal, if you don't have a rotary cutter and a ruler, it's really easy to just fold one corner of the fabric to meet the other straight side of the fabric, and make sure that there's a nice point at this end here and that you have a fold that's going straight across. This line should be perpendicular to this edge of your fabric. And then once you do that, you can use scissors to cut along that 45-degree line. You want to make this cut as straight as you can. If you want, you could mark it before you cut it, or you could press it with the iron to make a nice crease to cut along. If you have a rotary cutter and a ruler and a cutting mat, you can also use the 45-degree line on your rotary cutter, or on your ruler, and use that to cut your fabric. I'll just show you how to do that. So I already cut this part of the way, but I'm going to start from the other point over here. Line up, nope. Okay, here we go. Line up this 45-degree line with the edge of my fabric, and then bring it right to the point here. And then I will use my rotary cutter and cut this diagonal. You can see, because I have a gingham fabric, that that diagonal is running like right with the weave of the fabric. Which, if you have a plaid or a gingham, you'll be able to see really easily if you're cutting on the 45-degree. So then I'm just gonna cut to join up with this other cut that I started. But if you don't have a cut there, you would just continue cutting this line across to the other edge of the fabric. And now I have two pieces that I'm going to seam together along the straight edge, these two straight edges, to make one big trapezoid. Is that a trapezoid? Rhombus? So you'll just seam along this perpendicular to these edges to make this giant bias strip. If you have a right side of your fabric, this has two right sides, but if you have a right side, you want to put the right sides together when you do this seam. So you're welcome to pin this if you want, but I'm just gonna go for it and make it, straighten it as I go. When I sew this seam, because I'm gonna cut this into bias strips later, it's gonna be really short sections, and I want to make a short stitch length so that it doesn't unravel when I cut those into small strips. So go ahead and put your machine on like a 1 or a 1.5 stitch length. You want to have a straight stitch, and then your seam allowance doesn't really matter, but I'm just gonna do, I have this raw edge here, I'm gonna do like a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just make sure I'm not too close to that raw edge, that selvage. So with a short stitch length, just sew all the way down that seam. Once you've sewn that seam, go ahead and press it open. with your iron. Now you're going to go ahead and cut your bias tape. I'm going to show you the first way. That's the simplest way if you don't have a cutting mat and a rotary cutter. We will go ahead and cut strips from this and then sew them together to make a long length of bias tape so that we can cut it to whatever length we want and make the most of it. The bias tape we're going to cut at 1 3/4 of an inch wide, and you want to err on the side of a little bit narrower than that, so a scant 1 3/4 of an inch, and that way you'll get the most out of the width that you've just made of bias. So the way that you can do that if you just have scissors and not a rotary cutter is take a ruler and mark 1 3/4 of an inch down one side, and you want to make sure you're marking that on your bias. It should be stretchy along that length. So mark it all the way down, and then you can cut each strip with scissors. And then you'll just go ahead and cut along that line. Remember to err on the side of being a little bit narrow because we're gonna get just 24 yards of bias tape out of this. And if you have a chalk roller like I do, that's a really great thing to use because it makes a very accurate line. If you don't, you can use a pencil or a pen even, whatever you need to make a nice accurate mark along that length. So now I have a strip of bias tape. If you want to do a method where you don't have to sew these ends end to end after you make a bunch of strips, I'll show you how to make a continuous spiral of bias tape. And for that, you'll want to have a rotary cutter and a mat. For this one, you're just going to mark your 1 3/4 line at the very end, just maybe about an inch long. And then you'll mark a line perpendicular to that about a 1/2 inch in from the edge. It doesn't have to be exact, but something like that. And then on your other point, and make sure you're doing this on the right side of your fabric. You want the seam to not have the raw edges, so you're doing it on the right side of your fabric. You'll do the same thing on the other side. Make a mark at about 1 3/4, and then a line perpendicular at about a 1/2 inch from the raw edge. And for this, you'll want pins. Now you want to bring the less pointy corner across. We're basically going to take our 2 straight edges, like the non-bias edges, and sew them together. So we're bringing these 2 straight edges together. And those marks that I made are where I'm going to line up this corner like that. I want my straight edges to be lined up, and then this corner will be on that mark. So then I'll go down to the other side and I'll do the same thing with the mark I made down there. And then I'm gonna pin these straight edges all the way down together. Now that it's pinned all the way down, we're gonna sew along that edge at a 1/2 inch. It's a little bit wonky right now, but don't worry, it's all gonna work out. I'm gonna keep my stitch setting on a smaller stitch length so that these short cuts will be less likely to unravel. Now that you've sewn this seam, you can kind of shake your piece out and it turns into a tube of bias. It's a bias tube. And it has these little tabs on each side, which is the beginning and the end of your bias spiral. So now is when the real fun begins. You get to cut 24 yards of bias tape in a spiral. This might be a good time to pick out a Netflix show to watch while you're doing it. Or you might just get like real meditative with it. But you're gonna use your cutting mat, your ruler, and your rotary cutter. And starting at one end, you are going to cut your 1 3/4 inch bias tape at a scant 1 3/4 of an inch and just start working down that spiral. You'll just rotate your tube each time you cut and then continue on. Sometimes it's helpful to have something to like weigh that out of the way so it doesn't get in your way as you're cutting. Another thing you might do is put some masking tape right at that point at 1 3/4 to guide you as you're cutting, so it's easier to find that line. Once you're done cutting your bias tape, the last little bit of it, you might just have like an extra string that like little narrow piece of bias that you cut off of it. But now you have this long length of bias tape and it's time to press that. To finish off your bias tape and make it ready for sewing, you want to fold the 2 raw edges into the center and then press them. They don't have to exactly touch in the center. They can just have a little bit of space between them because then you'll fold it over and be able to sew it. One trick for sewing a long length of bias tape like this is to take a pin and pin it into your ironing board about the width of what your bias tape will finish at. And then you can get it started with your 2 edges folded in and pull it through there and just press it as you pull. And that helps fold those edges in and keep it the same width all the way down. Now your bias tape is ironed and ready to use.